So now that we're familiar with the basics of the different political and economic systems that individual countries use, we're going to talk about how international political and international economic systems function. And again, this is basics. This is getting some terminology and understanding some basic institutions that are going to pop up again and again throughout this semester. All right, just going through some basic terminology. Currency. Currency is just the money that a country uses. So here in the United States, our currency is the dollar. In Britain, it's the pound. In Mexico, it's the peso. That's just the currency of the country. Exchange rates. Of course, $1 doesn't necessarily just equal 1 peso and 1 pound. If you travel from one country to the other, or if you trade between the countries, you have to be able to convert your currency to another one. And that is, however much it's worth, is the exchange rate. So at the time of this recording, 1 US dollar is worth 22.5 Mexican pesos, and it's worth 0.8 pounds or British pounds. So of course what that means is the dollar is more valuable than the peso, and the pound is more valuable than the dollar. We'd have to exchange more than $1 just to get 1 pound. And what affects these rates, because they change really second by second, definitely day by day, is that the stronger an economy gets, the more it produces, the larger it gets, particularly compared to the population of that country, the more that money is worth. And that could be a great thing if we're buying things from overseas, in trade or in mail orders. If the dollar is worth more, that's then cheaper to us. We're able to buy it a whole lot easier because our money is worth more than that other country's money. But that also means that for people from those other countries, if the dollar is stronger, if it's worth more than their currency, they have to pay more to buy stuff from us, which affects our industries. So it's not necessarily better to have a strong currency, but you do want to have an accurate exchange rate. You want to be able to have faith in the fact that your money is worth as much as the people changing the money say it's worth in another currency. We'll be coming back to that. Imports and exports. Imports are when you ship things into a country. Exports is when you ship them out. So if China sells clothing to Britain, China is exporting clothing to Britain, and Britain is importing clothing from China. Just remember these terms, they'll be important. Trade deficits and trade surpluses. If you are importing more than you export, then you have a trade deficit. That means you're buying more things. You're sending more money out of the country than you are selling. Right? Because every time you sell something, you bring money into the country. Every time you buy it, you send it out of the country in international trade. And so, of course, a trade surplus is when you export more than you import. And this can be looked at as a whole, or it can be looked at country by country. So we import a lot more of stuff from China than we export to China. So we have a trade deficit with China, because we buy a lot of their stuff and they don't buy as much from us. And of course, I think you hear those terms, deficit and surplus, and we automatically think that surplus is better, that you want to have a surplus because you're bringing more money into the country. But it's not that cut and dry. Here in the United States, we have what is called a service-based economy, and so we don't produce as much as we used to. We still definitely grow a lot. We definitely are a major source of food for many different countries besides our own. But a lot of our work comes down to people going to restaurants, entertainment, finance, so people that just essentially facilitate trading deals, sports, movies. And those are all things that people need to have extra money in order to partake in. You have to first be able to take care of the basics. You have to be able to get the food that you need, and you need to be able to get all the essential physical things. To take this class, you have to have a computer. It's not just a frivolous luxury. It is a requirement to get through education this year. And the only way that we can have an economy where we can still afford to partake in American things, where we can still pay people wages for being waiters, for being bartenders, for being athletes, for running different organizations that provide services, we need to be able to get cheap stuff. And because we import so much from China, because China makes things more cheaply than we do, on the other side of this token, or on the other side of this ocean, there are people in China that just don't get paid anything compared to what an American would be paid for the exact same job. So we get cheap stuff, which means that we're able to keep our service economy going. This is not to say, again, that having a trade deficit is a good thing. It's just to say that nothing is ever that cut and dry. You've already come across this term development in your readings. Geographers use that term now in place of old terms like first, second, and third world. Geographers essentially talk about the level of development of a country. And so terms that you'll usually hear are developed, and that refers to places like the United States, Canada, Europe, Japan. Developing, and that refers to places like China or Mexico, areas that are still building infrastructure, that are still trying to build a vibrant economy that allows for a middle class. And that's really one of the features of developed countries. Developed countries have large middle classes. Developing countries are still building up that middle class. There are still plenty of people that live in poverty. And of course, underdeveloped countries, a term that sometimes geographers use, are countries that are stuck, that have not been able to stabilize their situation enough, have not been able to take control of their resources enough in order to build up a strong functioning economy. But development can also talk about more than just economy. We can talk about social development. So do countries have a very well-developed democratic tradition? Here in the United States, we have been voting for over 200 years, and our voting still works. Same thing in Europe. But there are countries like Ukraine that are still developing their democracy. They're not undeveloped. They have a democracy that's working. They just recently elected in a pretty popular president that has been trying to push back against a lot of the corruption that's just inherent in Ukraine. And voting has not always been reliable in Ukraine. They don't have a fully developed democracy yet. They are developing it. Education levels. Some countries are incredibly developed when it comes to their education. Some countries are still developing or underdeveloped. Safety and stability. When we're talking about development, we may be talking about countries that you can move around in freely without worrying that you're going to get mugged or murdered. And those would be fully developed countries. But we're going to come across places in the world that are essentially miniature war zones, even if there's not really a war taking place. Those would be underdeveloped countries when it comes to safety and stability. Both countries and regions are often referred to as cores or peripheries. Cores are where things are made. And when I say where things are made, that could mean factories, but that could also mean universities where knowledge is discovered. That can mean publication centers where authors do a lot of their work. And so like New York City is a core. It's where things are made. The periphery are where resources are extracted. And so the periphery is farmland, it's mining land, it's forested land. And the main difference between these two is that cores, in addition to making things, are more densely populated, and there's a lot more wealth in cores. And in cores, there may be big disparities where you still have impoverished people, but the total amount of wealth that is focused in core areas is important. And of course, that means they also have a lot of political control. Peripheries suffer from more people living with less money, and they have a tendency to have less economic and political influence. But these terms are relative. So like I said, New York City is definitely a core. And looking at it this way, most of the United States is periphery. Maybe New York City, Chicago, LA, San Francisco, Seattle, San Antonio, right? There's a few population centers, but most of this country is still pretty spread out compared to many other areas of the world. But we could also say that the United States as a whole is a core. And areas like Latin America are a periphery. They don't have as much power. They don't have as much wealth. They don't produce as much when it comes to the total amount of things, not just the extraction of resources through things like farming and mining, but actually making something out of those resources, creating cars or creating literature. At the same time, here in Nebraska, we can make the case that Norfolk is a core. It's the biggest city in northeast Nebraska, and the rest of the smaller cities and farmland around it would be the periphery. Of course, compared to Omaha, Norfolk isn't a core, and compared to New York City, it's not a core. It is all relative, but be familiar with these, because we're going to hear this term several times throughout the course, that this area is a core and this area is on the periphery. Gross domestic product. Gross domestic product is just the measurement of how much a country makes in a year. And when I say how much they make in a year, I mean everything. I'm talking about the cars that are produced. I'm talking about every time a plumber fixes the pipes or fixes some pipes and gives somebody a bill, whatever that bill is for, that is something that's revenue that was generated for that plumber. That goes to the gross domestic product. Every time a waiter gets tipped, every time an actor gets a job, all of that is going towards the GDP. And so the GDP of any country is the total sales of all goods and services in a country in a year. All goods, all things, and all services. But there's a few different ways to count this, and you need to know each one of them. Nominal GDP is just the raw numbers. So we added everything up in the United States and just stopped there. Just here's what the GDP is of the United States. That's the nominal amount. And that works to, give us a number, but it doesn't work really well for comparative purposes. So, for example, we know that inflation takes place over time, that things get more expensive. You probably know 100 years ago you could buy a candy bar for a nickel and now it's like $2. That's inflation. The candy bar didn't necessarily get more expensive to make, but the value of our money has diminished. And that's just because we have to keep printing more money, because the more people we have, the more money we need to be able to go around. We can't run a country on $1 million. We need to have the billions that are available to do business. But that also means that money loses some value over time. And so if we wanted to compare our economy from now to our economy from 40 years ago, to compare them directly, our money now is worth less. So even if the number is bigger, the money that we make now is more than we used to make, that doesn't necessarily mean the economy has grown. We have to actually adjust for inflation. And this is what we call real GDP, or real dollars. Whenever we're talking in real dollars, we're saying adjusted for inflation. That's what that term means. So, for example, this is a graph of the federal minimum wage since 1970 all the way up until 2013. As you can see, in 1970, the federal minimum wage was about $1.50. However, $1.50 in 1970 is able to buy essentially the same amount as just under $9 in 2013. And so we can see the nominal value of the federal minimum wage going up. In the modern day, it's still $7.25 an hour. But because money continuously gets worth less, we can see how the federal minimum wage has went down in real dollars when it's adjusted for inflation. Now, at the same time, we also have to think about how we can compare between one country and another, because one of the issues with GDP is how much can you actually buy with that? So, to give you an example, if you wanted to buy just an apartment, one apartment unit in New York City, it would cost so much more than it would cost to buy like a 2-bedroom house here in Norfolk. Because money just doesn't go as far in New York City as it does here in Norfolk. Our cost of living is lower. Food is cheaper here. Rent is cheaper here. And so if we wanted to compare the money that we make here to the money we would make in New York City, we would have to look at what we call purchasing power parity, or PPP. How much can you actually purchase? And so since everything here is so much cheaper than it is in New York City. And so if we wanted to compare how much somebody is making in Norfolk to how much they could be making in New York City, we would have to adjust those numbers. So $50,000 a year in Norfolk, you can live a pretty solid middle-class life. $50,000 a year in New York City, you cannot live a very comfortable life, particularly if you're living in Manhattan. And so the $50,000 here isn't the same as the $50,000 here, because the money goes farther here. In order to compare them well, we have to adjust these numbers in accordance with how much you can purchase in that area. So if we compare the GDPs of the United States and India, the GDP of India can buy a whole lot more in India than it can in the United States. So if things like rent and food were half as expensive in India than they are in the United States, right? You'd have to double them in order to make them equally United States. Then that would also mean that we'd have to take the GDP of India and double it to make it comparable to the United States. Purchasing power parity. Adjusting GDP in accordance with how much can actually be bought in that country compared to how much can be bought in the country you're comparing it to. And finally, per capita. And this is just how much money is made per person. Per capita just means per person. And this is important because if you're trying to compare the economy of one country that has 100 million people to the economy of a country that has just 1 million people, well, you would expect the country with 100 million people to make 100 times more than the country with just 1 million people. That doesn't really make a clear comparison as to how well everybody has the opportunity to live in that country. So quite often we will adjust GDP by how much there is per person, divide it by the size of the population. So if the country that has 100 million people has a $100 million GDP, that means everybody there gets $1. But if the country with 1 million people has a $10 million GDP, well, that sounds like it's less than the other one, but if we divide it by its population, everybody gets $10. Obviously not the best numbers, but you see how making that adjustment really lets us know how wealthy the country is per person. And so with these basic economic terms, I just want to talk a little bit about the structures and tools that are used on the international stage in order to run the world economy. Economic competition is central to understanding world conflict. Economic competition has always been tied to wars, to how violence breaks out. Kings in the medieval period attacked each other so they could get other kings' land. Imperial countries took over other places and turned them into colonies so they could extract their resources, and then those imperial countries went to war with other empires so they could take their land, so they could extract that wealth. But for the last couple centuries, a lot of the economic competition that has taken place across the world has taken place within the structure of capitalism. This idea that individuals and corporations can own the means of production and they can try to outcompete each other in the marketplace. They can try to outcompete each other in places like the stock market or in who can make the best widget. And for most of this period of capitalism of the last couple hundred years, countries have made use of a tool that's called tariffs. Tariffs have been a major feature of the world economy for quite some time. And a tariff is just a tax on an import. A tariff is just a tax on something that is shipped into a country. Not only does that tariff make some money for the country's government, but it also makes imports a little bit more expensive than the things that are made at home. So if a Canadian steel company wants to sell steel to a U.S. automobile company, when that steel comes over the border, they're going to have to pay a tariff on it. And so let's say they pay a 25% tariff on it. For every $100 that the Canadian company is making by exporting into the United States, for every $100 worth of product, they're going to have to pay $25 to the United States government. But of course, if they're selling for, this product for $100, and that was already not making a large profit for them, they can't afford a 25% tariff. And so what that means is they're going to charge that U.S. automobile company $125 for each $100 worth of steel that gets sent in. it is the person that is buying the import, or the company that's buying the import, that usually pays the cost of a tariff, or at least a good chunk of the cost of a tariff. The cost of tariffs usually get passed on to the end consumer, to the people that are buying the products that are being shipped in. And part of the idea behind this is that it makes American steel companies more competitive. Maybe that U.S. car company or automobile company will decide to buy steel from Pennsylvania instead of from Canada, because that $100 worth of steel from Pennsylvania doesn't come with that extra tax on it. It's going to be cheaper. That's the idea behind tariffs. Of course, there's always more that comes into it. How quickly is it going to come? What's the quality of the product that's being sent? But tariffs have been used to protect the home country businesses that the country that's laying the tariffs down are trying to protect. Now, this was something that tariffs before World War II, so throughout the 1800s, the first half of the 1900s, tariffs across the world were pretty darn high. There was a lot of what we call protectionism, where countries tried to protect their home industries by laying really high tariffs on foreign goods. And what that ended up doing was limiting world trade. It kept each country, or at least empire, really kind of economically walled off from the ones around them. Trade still happened, but it wasn't as much as it is in the modern day. World War II, which lasted from 1939 to 1945, and you do need to know that date, particularly 1945. The world changes in 1945. The modern world that we know starts really in 1945. And since the end of World War II, tariffs have plummeted. Tariffs have been coming down consistently for the last 75 years. This has caused more trade between different countries, and one of the results of having all that trade, it means that different countries' economies have been woven more closely together, and when you weave economies more closely together, countries have a tendency to be more cooperative. You don't want to go to war with a country that you depend on for steel or bullets. If you can't actually get the things you need to make war because that other country has been your supplier for so long, it's a lot harder to go to war with them. And so integrating economies, and this has been a very purposeful thing since the end of World War II, has in part been about preserving the peace. It also has been about wealth creation. Throughout history, the more trade that happens, the richer people get, because people can specialize and do things better than somebody else, and instead of having one person or one country trying to do a little bit of everything, they can really perfect something, and then let somebody else perfect something, and this ends up creating more wealth. It does have its drawbacks, and we'll discuss some of those, but the massive amounts of wealth that have been generated since World War II, and the significant decline in the consistency and scale of warfare since World War II, has in large part been about this lowering of tariffs and this integrating of a world economy. And this integration of the world economy is what we call globalization. That war, World War II, it brought to a head 450 years of colonialism, of Europe going out and taking over the world, carving it up into separate empires, competing against each other, being at near continuous war with each other. It's difficult for us to fathom how insane and how destructive World War II was. And that was after the crazy destruction of World War I during the 1910s. World leaders, many world leaders on the side of the Allies, on the side of the people that were fighting against the Germans and against the Japanese. As the war was coming to a close, they started thinking very deeply about, how do we make sure this doesn't happen anymore? How do we create a world that is not always trying to tear itself apart, especially after the creation of the nuclear bomb that was dropped in 1945 to finally end the war with Japan? It wasn't feasible for humanity to go forward with that much violence. So near the end of the war, they started planning out what we often call the New World Order, where they tried to create a new type of world, one that was not dominated by colonialism, one that was not dominated by economic competition. And one of the important parts of that was decolonization. After World War II, European countries and the United States started giving freedom to a lot of their colonies. We'll talk about this as we go along, but in the 50s and 60s and 70s, colonies that had been owned by European and American powers were finally given their independence. And that decolonization didn't come without problems, and we are going to be discussing those problems, but I want you to be familiar with that term, that there was a concerted effort on the part of some people to end this colonial system. And so in this New World Order, right off the bat, 3 different organizations were chartered, 3 organizations were begun that would go on to be crucial to creating wealth across the world and limiting war across the world. The United Nations is a big one. Now, the United Nations is a forum for constant connection and negotiation between different nations. The intended idea was that they could find diplomatic solutions before wars started. So you'd have a place where every country in the world could have a representative where they could chat things out before things really started getting messy. The UN was also intent on creating coalitions to contain what we call rogue states. These are countries that have decided they don't care about international law, they don't care about international norms, they don't care about humanitarian rights. The United Nations was created in the hopes that those countries, or at least the governments of those countries, could be brought back into the mainstream. Now, the world has just under 200 countries, and virtually all of those countries are in the UN. There are some countries that their independence isn't widely enough to acknowledge for them to join. So Palestine, some would call it its own country. It's right next to Israel. It's probably the most famous example of this, where Palestine does get to actually have somebody at the UN that can speak for them. They are not a member country, and they're not recognized as an independent country, at least not as of the recording of this video. Funding for the UN comes from this kind of complex formula for determining how much each country is supposed to be paying, and it's made up so that richer countries cover most of the budget. And the UN has this rather complex, what we would call a decentralized structure. There are 6 different parts to the UN. Really 5, but 6 is the official number. We'll be back to that in a second. And even though these 6 different parts kind of check each other's power and they interact, there is no central one that is in total control. Each of these parts are called organs. So the UN officially has 6 different organs, like organs in a body. At the center of this chart right here, we have the General Assembly. With its 193 members, all members send delegations to represent it, but each country only gets 1 vote. So each country has a main ambassador, but they have helpers and whatnot. And the General Assembly votes on recommendations that it can make to other members of the country or to other organs of the UN. These are called resolutions. And so the General Assembly has the power to recommend ideas, to pass a resolution that says most of the countries of the world agree with this idea, but it doesn't really have a lot of power to make anything directly happen. But they do elect both individuals and countries to positions within the other UN organs. And this is really the only meaty power that the General Assembly has. It does get to place people in other parts of the UN, and those countries and the people that represent those countries have actual power to do some things. And the other main power that the General Assembly has is it does set the UN budget. So it gets to decide how much financing for different programs and for different organs within the UN. Possibly the most important organ is what we call the Security Council. It's the part of the UN that really has the ability to take action. And the Security Council can issue what are called binding resolutions. So these are resolutions that all members of the UN are supposed to have to abide by. So, for example, the Security Council can put sanctions on countries that are breaking international law. They can say something like, nobody's allowed to buy their oil. And that, of course, if the country that gets that sanction on it, if they make their economy work off of oil, they're going to find themselves going broke real quick. Or the Security Council could say something like, nobody's allowed to play sports with this country until they make the improvements, until they take care of their human rights issue, or until they pull out of war with another country. The Security Council can actually authorize military intervention. UN troops are called peacekeepers, and they wear blue helmets like you can see in this image right here. But those peacekeepers aren't really UN troops exactly. Those are made up of troops from member states. And so, the United States or Britain or India or Japan or China might go ahead and contribute some troops to a UN mission. And those troops, again, wear those blue helmets. They're called peacekeepers. But ultimately, the countries that contributed those troops can take those troops out of that situation whenever they want. It's not the best way to run a military, but it is how countries have been able to not lose their sovereignty or not lose their independence towards each other. There are 5 permanent seats on the Council: the United States, France, Britain, Russia, and China. These were the league countries of the Allies during World War II, and they've just got to sit on the Security Council ever since. And these 5 folks can veto any resolution that's being discussed. So if there is an issue taking place in an ally, in one of Russia's allies, so if there's a problem taking place in Iran, which is an ally of Russia, and the Security Council gets together and says, we need to send in troops, or we need to put sanctions on them, or we need to put some other binding resolution that gets Iran or gets Iran in line, Russia can just say, nope. They can stop that discussion. They can veto it and say none of that's going to happen. It just takes one country to do it. In addition to the 5 permanent seats on the Council, there are 10 non-permanent seats. They're voted in by the General Assembly. So the General Assembly picks what countries get to sit on that, and those countries sit on it for 2 years. Over here on the left, we have the Secretariat. This is the executive organ of the UN. It's kind of like the UN's version of the White House. It's the part that actually runs the programs that have been set up by the General Assembly. It's made up of around 20 different departments, and each one focuses on different issues, like humanitarian, peace negotiation issues, or a department that points out violations of international law, or a department that provides assembly committees with actual staff, gets them the researchers and translators and graphic designers that they need. The Secretariat is headed by the Secretary General. And the Secretary General is actually selected by the Security Council. The one thing that those 5 countries agreed to at the very beginning is that they would never hold the Secretary General position. So the Secretary General can never be British, American, French, Chinese, or Russian. But that Security Council does get to nominate who the Secretary General is going to be, and then the Secretary General is approved or not approved by the General Assembly. Secretary Generals serve 5-year terms, and most of them serve a total of 2 terms. These are really the big 3 organs of the UN, and these are the ones that you really need to understand. I do like how this diagram points out the General Assembly recommends, the Security Council decides, and they also run the peacekeeping forces, and the Secretary General implements or executes the ideas. So these 3 are probably what we normally really think of when we're thinking of the UN. It's the government of the UN. The other 3 organs are set up to actually take humanitarian actions to try to make the world a better place. The International Court of Justice, this is the judicial organ of the UN. Sometimes you'll hear it called the World Court. It's based in a Western European city, a city called The Hague, and sometimes when you just hear The Hague, people are talking about the ICJ. They're talking about the World Court. It is the only organ that's not headquartered in New York City, and it's made up of 15 judges. They're elected to 9-year terms by the General Assembly and the Security Council. Candidates for one of those judgeships has to be approved by a majority in both of those organs, both the Assembly and the Security Council. And they rule on international law disputes between different countries. So if one country thinks another is breaking international law, they can file suit in the World Court. These 2 other organs you don't really need to know. The Economic and Social Council, 54 countries are elected to it by the General Assembly, and they provide advice to the General Assembly and to different member countries on economic and social issues. And the Trusteeship Council, that was actually created to help decolonization. That was helped to guide colonies into independence and to push member countries to give their colonies independence. But the Trusteeship Council has not met since 1994. There are some other independent agencies that are somewhat part of the UN, but they run themselves in partnership with the UN. An example of this is the World Health Organization, or the WHO. And there is another court that's based in The Hague that is associated with the UN, but it's pretty legally separate. This is called the International Criminal Court, or the ICC. And the ICC is where people who are accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity are tried. So there are folks that after the UN or after other countries have went in to countries where there are crimes against humanity taking place, when they arrest generals or leaders or presidents that were engaged in things like genocide, they bring them to the ICC. And beyond the United Nations, the world is filled with what we call NGOs, non-government organizations. These are non-profit groups trying to do good in the world. So NGOs would include things like the YMCA or Habitat for Humanity or the Red Cross. A lot of these NGOs have connections with the UN and work with the UN, but they are completely independent. So when you hear that term NGO, it's just a non-profit organization, non-government organization trying to do some good, or at least hopefully trying to do some good. So that's international politics, and we're going to wrap up this lecture with international finance and trade. So going back to some of those terms that we were discussing just a little while ago. The first organization that we're going to talk about in this section is something called the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. The IMF is affiliated with the UN as part of what we call the UN system, and almost all countries are part of it, but not quite all of them. Like the UN, it's funded by dues that are paid by countries' governments, and the IMF provides really essential services to many countries. One of the things that it does is that it actually monitors the world economy. It collects tons of economic data to help create a clear picture of the world economy for everybody, but also it helps out its individual members. It points out potential risks before they actually manifest. So before something can go wrong, the IMF can be like, hey, we see this economic trend over here, and we think that that's going to hit you next. Be prepared for it, a good thing or a bad. In addition to just monitoring the world economy and providing advice to its member countries, all that information that it collects is used to make clear comparisons between currencies in different countries. And so the IMF helps regulate currency exchange rates. Remember, we had talked about this before. When you are trading with other countries, when you have to actually exchange your currency, or you have to work in their currency, or they have to work in your currency, you want to make sure that the exchange rate is accurate. You want to make sure you're not getting ripped off. And before the IMF, individual traders of currency and even governments were able to set their currency value really at whatever they thought they could get for it, which resulted in what we call currency manipulation. Like, you can make your currency worth more when you want to buy stuff and less when you want to sell things. The IMF in large part was instituted to make sure that exchange rates were accurate and fair. And finally, the IMF acts as what we call the lender of last resort. What this means is that if there are governments, not companies, not individuals, but governments that are on the edge of bankruptcy, that they are about to not be able to pay their bills, which would really cause their currency to become worthless, the IMF will step in and they will provide a loan. But this is not something that's done lightly. The reason why member states contribute money to the IMF, and they're okay with the IMF loaning money to states that aren't doing well, governments that didn't manage their economies very well, is because if one country's economy collapses, everything else that's tied into them, and remember, this has all been about tying together economies, is going to feel that collapse. There's going to be people that are going to be leaving the country looking for work, which can cause some issues. There are going to be people in the country that owe money to other people in other countries that aren't going to be able to pay that off anymore. And countries that financially fall apart become centers of violence. And so the IMF is there to step in, but the IMF, when it gives loans, those loans come with some strings. The IMF will make certain requirements of a government, like say something along the lines of, you just have to tell all of your people that we're getting Social Security that they're not going to get it anymore, or they're only going to get half of it. All the pensions that you owe, you're going to have to not do them, or you only have to pay a percentage of them. The IMF will force the government to take what we call austerity measures, to trim back on the public services it provides. It might even make the case like, hey, you just can't provide that level of education anymore. You're going to have to charge more for your colleges. And you can see how this is the type of thing that if you have a population, could you imagine if here in the United States, if all of a sudden your grandparents were told they're not going to get their Social Security checks anymore, or they're not going to get their retirement checks anymore. Nobody takes that on lightly. Now, the IMF was created in 1945, just as World War II was ending, and it was created at the exact same conference as the World Bank was created. They're really what we could call sister institutions. The World Bank is also affiliated with the UN. It's also part of what we call the UN system. But the World Bank is set up primarily to help out countries that were coming out of colonialism. It provides loans to developing countries for them to develop their infrastructure. It's meant to help ex-colonies get on their own feet. And when I say infrastructure, I'm talking about roads and bridges, but I'm also talking about hospitals and schools and internet and all the parts of a society that it takes to be able to function in the modern world economy. So the idea is, we'll give you the money you need to get all that infrastructure up and running so that you can have a functioning economy, pay off the loans, and now you'll be no longer a developing country, you'll be a developed country. Or at least that's the dream. But one of the issues is that World Bank loans, like IMF loans, come with strings attached. Governments need to create policies that encourage private investment. And quite often that private investment in these developing countries doesn't mean that people in those countries are going to invest. It means that outsiders are going to invest. In addition to the government creating policies that encourage private investment, many programs that they have that are meant to help the poor are diminished or they are abolished. You can imagine how this is particularly difficult for poor people in a poor country. There are some folks that criticize the World Bank as just a continuation of colonialism. So now, instead of countries being owned directly by other countries, rich countries and rich individuals can now own poorer countries just by owning their debt and owning many of the companies and corporations within these developing countries. And I don't want to paint the World Bank as one big evil pursuit. The people of the World Bank, most of them, are trying to do good. It's just that all this is pretty darn complicated. And finally today we have the World Trade Organization, or the WTO. And this is another thing that is affiliated with the UN, another thing that is part of what we call the UN system. And the WTO oversees most of the world's trade. It's made up of a little over 160 countries. Each country gets one vote in decision-making in the WTO. And even though the WTO is relatively young, it is rooted in a trade agreement that was created right after World War II. Just a few years after World War II, a few countries got together and created the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or the GATT. And you do need to know it because it is sometimes referenced in economic news or research that you're going to end up doing on different economies. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade really worked to lower different tariffs between member countries. So the GATT was this trade group. It was a group of countries that would come together and say, we're going to find ways to come up with agreements that can lower tariffs across the board. Because you could just say something like, we're going to just go ahead and start with lowering tariffs on cars. All of us are going to lower tariffs on cars. That's fantastic for a place like the United States that produces a lot of cars. Doesn't work very well for a place like France that is not known for its car manufacturers. And so then they might say, okay, so we'll lower the tariff rate on cars and we'll lower the tariff rate on wine. so that France can benefit from it as well. And of course, somebody else would then say, well, what about the corn that we grow, or what about the steel that we make? And so these trade talks are complicated, but the idea was, if you can find ways to carve out a niche for everybody, everybody would start to agree to lower their tariffs. And again, integrate their economies more, limiting the possibility of war, and putting their economies into overdrive. Remember, trade makes economies grow. It always has. Well, the GATT in the 1950s and the 1960s kept lowering tariffs. The countries that were part of it were seeing major economic growth, so more countries wanted to join up. And finally, in 1995, they decided, instead of this ad hoc treaty, they would create a permanent organization where they could work on hammering out trade deals across the world. In 1995, the WTO was created. Now, the WTO, again, is something where each country has a vote in its decision makings, and it's there to do things like set standards. So, goods that are traded through the WTO aren't supposed to be made by slave labor. I say aren't supposed to be because, as we're going to see throughout this course, people find ways around those rules. But you can't just have open slave labor. You can't sell something through the WTO saying like, oh yeah, we have a bunch of slaves that made that for us. It puts other restrictions on things that are traded that do require some level of safety and ability to make a living for workers. The organization itself is a forum for countries to negotiate trade agreements individually as well as groups. And the WTO, if the majority of its countries vote on it, can put economic sanctions on a country that's breaking the rules. So if it is found out that one of the countries is selling things that are made with slave labor, a case can be brought, they can debate it, and then they can take a vote. Are we going to allow this country to continue to sell these things through the WTO, or are they going to have to go out and negotiate their own trade agreements separately? At this point, over 98% of all world trade is regulated by the WTO. So just about all world trade is run through the rules and regulations of the WTO. And to give you an idea as to how effective the GATT and the WTO have been, in 1945, when World War II ended, tariffs around the world averaged around 22%. So some were 50%, some were 5%, depended on what item you were talking about or what good you were talking about, as well as what countries were involved. But that was a pretty high average tariff. Now, the average is below 5%. And all these things, the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, all of them have contributed to the globalized world that we live in, the interconnected world. Remember all this stuff when we actually start looking at individual countries and thinking about how they relate to all the countries around them and all the countries across the globe.